Hi everyone, it's Spina 007 here for the 61st episode of the Agatha Christie Reread. And this is a thriller novel called Passenger to Frankfurt, an Extravaganza. And it is very much with that in mind that you should read this novel because it is almost like a James Bond novel. It's a wildly fantastical thriller set in a world that is full of paranoia and political upheaval. We often focus on the social events surrounding the novel and talk about what it would have been that readers would have had in their minds when they received their Christie for Christmas. But in this novel, I ask you to turn that on its head and to think about what Agatha Christie would have been absorbing from the news events of the time as she set out to write her extravaganza. This really is not a puzzle mystery, and so we will not do the usual thing where we are spoiler free to the end credits and then discuss the solution and clues, as there are not really any solutions or clues to this book. So this will be spoiler free all the way along. So if you prefer not to be spoiled, please read the book before listening. So this novel was published in 1970, September of that year, so a little earlier than the typical Christie for Christmas, published in November. It follows on from the Hercule Poirot book Halloween Party, which is far more conventional, and comes before, again, a rather more conventional Miss Marple novel, Nemesis. The book opens with a quote from Jan Smuts. He was a very famous South African statesman, military leader, philosopher. He was the Prime Minister of pre-apartheid South Africa. And the quotation is, "Leadership, besides being a great creative force, can be diabolical." I think it's also important to focus on the fact that this is one of the very rare novels in which Agatha Christie gives an introductory statement, where she talks about what inspires her novels, something she's overheard, an interesting turn of phrase. She had a novel called Why Didn't They Ask Evans? And she says sometimes you just hear a phrase and you know that's how you want to have a book start. But she also talks about the events of the time and how they can influence her as well. And this is what she says, quote, "Buildings and telephone kiosks smashed and gutted, drug smuggling, robbery and assault, children missing and children's murdered bodies found not far from their homes. Can this really be England? Is England really like this? One feels no, not yet, but it could be. Fear is awakening, fear of what may be, not so much because of actual happenings, but because of the possible causes behind them, some known, some unknown, but felt, and not only in our own country. There are smaller paragraphs on other pages, giving news from Europe, from Asia, from the Americas, worldwide news. Hijacking of planes, kidnapping, violence, riots, hate, anarchy, all growing stronger, all seeming to lead to worship of destruction, pleasure in cruelty. What does it all mean? An Elizabethan phrase echoes from the past, speaking of life here with a capital L. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now, this is me interjecting. That's a quote from Macbeth. Now, back to Agatha Christie. Quote, "And yet one knows of one's own knowledge how much goodness there is in this world of ours. The kindness is done, the goodness of heart, the acts of compassion, the kindness of neighbour to neighbour, the helpful actions of girls and boys. Then why this fantastic atmosphere of daily news, of things that happen, that are actual facts? To write a story in this year of our Lord, 1970, you must come to terms with your background. If the background is fantastic, then the story must accept its background. It too must be a fantasy, an extravaganza. The setting must include the fantastic facts of daily life. Can one envisage a fantastic cause, a secret campaign for power? Can a maniacal desire for destruction create a new world? Can one go a step further and suggest deliverance by fantastic and impossible sounding means? Nothing is impossible. Science has taught us that. The story is in essence a fantasy. It pretends to be nothing more. But most of the things that happen in it are happening, or giving promise of happening in the world of today. It is not an impossible story, it is only a fantastic one." What an amazingly portentous start to a novel. And it's with this in mind that I want to discuss the social events that we talk about at the start of these podcasts and think about what we've seen since World War II, which of course Agatha Christie lived through, worked through, nursed through, lived through the Blitz, and the world that she has lived through now in her 80th year, her 80th birthday. This was given a great fanfare, this novel, as being the 80th birthday book of Agatha Christie. What has she lived through in her 70s and in the world's 1960s? Well, we've seen the student protests, Les Événements de 1968, that have happened in universities around the world, university students coming up trying to protest civil rights or feminism or just bashing themselves against the patriarchy, which they see as ethically invalid since they know that their fathers and grandfathers took us into World War II. We see an increase in hijackings, in kidnappings, people like the Baader Meinhof gang, who are kidnapping industrialists and corporate men in Western Europe. And hijackings are a huge thing. International air travel is becoming more precarious. We also see, and are shortly to see in the 1972 Munich Olympics, an awful terrorist attack aimed at the Israeli athletes. So the events in the Middle East, this sort of fractious post-colonial winding down of great powers and smaller powers coming up to take their place and to cause ructions. So yes, it must have seemed like a very, very unstable time to Agatha Christie, especially coming from someone living in England, a former colonial power, having gone now through the Suez Crisis. You've had huge political instability in the 1960s, economic instability. This is a country that within 6 or 7 years will be going to the International Monetary Fund asking for a bailout. And lest you think tales of coups and sort of big super national powers coming together to seize control of government, I'd remind you of that episode in The Crown that highlighted a very weird episode in English history in 1968, where the Queen's relative, Lord Mountbatten, was kind of lured into maybe taking part into a coup to unseat the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, a military coup in this country. So, although, as Agatha Christie says, the events of this book are fantastical, I think in the very febrile atmosphere of the late 60s and early 70s, they're not outlandish. And of course, there is, again, a rich vein of literature that looks at counterfactual history with what would have happened had Hitler survived or key Nazis survived, all those books and films like The Boys from Brazil and Marathon Man. So I think this is very much Agatha Christie writing something fantastical, easily mocked, but very much of its time. With that, let's get into the social events of the age as we get into this novel. So, in December 1969, just after the publication of Halloween Party, we had the first draft lottery in the US as students were being and other young people being drafted to serve in the Vietnam War, hence the horrific protests that Agatha speaks of in this novel. In December of that year, we had the first flight of a 747 jumbo jet. In December of that year, we have Meredith Hunter stabbed to her death by Hell's Angels at the Altamont Free Concert, an event that came to be viewed as the end of the hippie era and the de facto conclusion of late 60s American youth culture. But again, you can see why Agatha Christie would think, my goodness, what a violent world in which we live, especially as that's also the month where Charles Manson is allowed to defend himself at the Tate LaBianca murder trial. In February of 1970, the multi-business conglomerate Virgin Group is founded by Richard Branson in the UK. It starts as a discount mail-order record retailer. And this is absolutely fascinating considering the topic of this novel. In April 4th of 1970, fragments of burnt human remains believed to be those of Adolf Hitler, Eva Braun, Josef Goebbels, Magda Goebbels, and the Goebbels children are crushed and scattered in the Biederitz River at a KGB center in Magdeburg, East Germany. April 10th, in a press release written in mock interview style that is included in promotional copies of his first solo album, Paul McCartney announces that he has left the Beatles. So yes, truly, truly the 1960s peace and love is over. In May of 1970, and again this speaks so closely to what the topic of this book is, Ulrike Meinhof helps Andreas Baader escape and creates the Red Army faction in West Germany, which exists until 1998. And this is a radical domestic terrorist group, kidnapping, hijacking, blowing things up, trying to sort of push against patriarchal German society. In July 1970, the Aswan High Dam in Egypt is completed. Another event in July speaks of the worldwide tumult that Agatha Christie is reflecting in this book. There is an Omani coup d'etat. Said bin Taimur, Sultan of Muscat and Oman, is deposed in a bloodless palace coup by his son Qaboos with covert British support. Covert support, again, very much the theme of this book. Among the reforms he introduces is the abolition of chattel slavery in Oman only in 1970. Very tragically, in July of this year, we also get the thalidomide scandal. Damages totaling £485,000 in that year were awarded to 28 thalidomide victims in the UK. And here we go, another thing that is very much of its time and of this book. In September, Black September, King Hussein of Jordan orders the Jordanian armed forces to oust Palestinian Fedayeen from Jordan. Black September will then go on to be the name of the terrorist group that mounts the attack in the Munich Olympics that I talked about earlier. And in September of 1970, we have the death of Jimi Hendrix, dies of an overdose, aged 27 in London, 2 days after last playing in public. Xander, Lord Byron, and I were talking about how almost like world-changing it was when we first heard Jimi Hendrix play, and what a tragic death so early. But again, another symbol of all the hope and optimism of the 60s just dying its death as we enter the 70s. So all of this social change exists as a background to this fantastical novel. And of course, there's all the usual, far more domestic social change that we have come to know in Agatha Christie, a woman who started writing in 1920 and is still writing in 1970. Here's a passage about the ennui of plane travel, and also changing fashions. And I think this is wonderful, right? When she started writing, it was literally horse and carriages, and now plane travel is so monotonous that it's actually boring. Quote, journeys all over the globe, how romantic it ought to be, but there was something about the atmosphere of a passenger's lounge in an airport that chilled romance. It was too full of people, too full of things to buy, too full of similarly coloured seats, too full of plastic, too full of human beings, too full of crying children. This is very much how I feel when I'm in a business lounge. And then this is the further quote. He looked disparagingly at two young women splendidly made up, dressed in the national uniform of their country, England he presumed, of shorter and shorter miniskirts, and another young woman, even better made up, in fact quite good-looking, who was wearing what he believed to be called a culotte suit. She had gone a little further along the road of fashion, end quote. So my goodness, we're starting to have the birth of modern feminism and the feminist backlash against the miniskirt, and, shockingly, the trouser seat. We have some social change that Agatha Christie has remarked upon previously. Here is Aunt Matilda, who is like honestly one of the best characters in all of Agatha Christie. Aunt Matilda commenting on trains and supermarkets. Quote, Aunt Matilda suggested likely trains for next week with the warning that they very often did not run or changed their plans, and also commanded that he should bring her down a camembert cheese and half a Stilton. Impossible to get anything down here now. Our own grocer, such a nice man, so thoughtful and such good taste in what we all liked, turned suddenly into a supermarket, 6 times the size, all rebuilt, baskets and wire trays to carry round and try to fill up with things you don't want, and mothers always losing their babies and crying and having hysterics. Most exhausting. Well, I'll be expecting you, dear boy, she rang off, end quote. And even just like how a young, upwardly mobile man lives his life. Well, maybe he's not that young, he's probably more 40s. His breakfast, Sir Stafford Nye, that's the hero of this novel, will be coffee made in a percolator and toast. No more full English breakfast set on the sideboard with kippers. Transportation. Yes, let's speak about the renaming of London Airport to Heathrow. I think this is the first mention we get of Heathrow Airport, which was renamed in 1966 to avoid confusion with Gatwick and Stansted. Used to be called London Airport. And as Aunt Matilda alluded to earlier, this is the world after Dr. Beeching, where a lot of the train lines have been gotten rid of, a lot of the stations closed in the name of efficiency because people aren't using trains as much, they're driving everywhere. So this is Aunt Matilda further going on about trains. Quote, but of course, Staffy dear, it will be lovely to have you. Take the 4:30 train. It still runs, you know, but it gets here an hour and a half later. And it leaves Paddington later, 5:15. That's what they mean by improving the railways, I suppose. Stops at several most absurd stations on the way. End quote. So there you go. I love how she still refers to the now 5:15 train as the 4:30. That seems so on the ball for how people behave. We also have, curiously for this novel, because it will have as its topic conspiracies and spies, the explicit mention of Kim Philby. Now, Kim Philby was one of the Cambridge Five, A group of spies who were recruited by the Communist Party in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, 30s in Cambridge University went on to some quite great heights of British establishment until they were exposed. Actually, I mean, Blunt wasn't fully exposed till my lifetime, till the early 80s. But Kim Philby was exposed in the 50s and did a runner to Moscow. Here's a quotation. Charleston, Conway, and Courtfold, he said, fully trusted, vetted, and approved of, all beginning with C, all crooked as sin. And then he will mention Kim Philby as well. So, yes, explicit mention of the Cambridge spies or allusions to the Cambridge spies. And then there is a marvelous passage about reading and how children used to read and how illicit it was to read novels, which must be exactly how Agatha Christie grew up. And this must have been very much on her mind at this point, because we'll get even more discourse on how young kids started to read in Poston of Fate, which is the last Tommy and Tuppence novel published a few years later. Quote, you wouldn't know about it, I expect, after your time, but when I was a girl, that's about the first taste of romance we got. This is Aunt Matilda talking about Prisoner of Zenda. Again, this will come up in Poston of Fate. Quote, not pop singers or Beatles, just a romantic novel. We weren't allowed to read novels when I was young, not in the morning anyways. You could read them in the afternoon. What extraordinary rules, said Sir Stafford. Why is it wrong to read novels in the morning and not in the afternoon? Well, in the mornings, you see, girls were supposed to be doing something useful. You know, doing the flowers or cleaning the silver photograph frames. All the things we girls did. Doing a bit of studying with the governess, all that sort of thing. In the afternoons, we were allowed to sit down and read a storybook, and The Prisoner of Zenda was usually one of the first ones that came our way. End quote. So that must be exactly how Agatha grew up, I think, in her country house with the governess, largely an autodidact. Okay, so let's get into the characters and the subject of this book. And once again, this is not going to have any spoiler-free section. We're going to go straight into spoilers because there's nothing to deduce in this book. The principal character is Sir Stafford Nye. He's an English diplomat. He is mid-40s. He's got a great sense of humour, but he's seen as rather unreliable. And in fact, some of the people working around him wonder if he is a bit of a Kim Philby because he's such a rebel. He reminds me somewhat of Chips Channon if you ever read his very unreliable diaries from the 30s and 40s. But he has a rather Byronic air. He wears a very flamboyant cape, which is going to aid the opening of this novel. Here is a description of him, which is rather marvellous. Quote, there was something about him of the 18th century buck. He liked to be noticed. His particular kind of affectation when travelling was a kind of bandit's cloak, which he had once purchased in Corsica. It was a very dark purply blue, had a scarlet lining, and had a kind of burnous hanging down behind, which he could draw up over his head when he wished to, so as to obviate draughts. A burnous is a sort of Middle Eastern hood, a hooded cape. Quote, Sir Stafford Nye had been a disappointment in diplomatic circles. Marked out in early youth by his gifts for great things, he had singularly failed to fulfil his early promise. A peculiar and diabolical sense of humour was wont to afflict him in what would have been his most serious moments. End quote. So as the novel opens, he's coming back to London and he's sitting in Frankfurt airport, and this lady, the aforementioned lady in the trouser seat, says, I am in desperate danger. Please can I borrow your cloak and your passport and your boarding pass? It's the only way I'm going to make it in London disguised and travelling as you. And if you agree to this, I will leave a glass of beer. I will dope it for you, and you can go and have a nice sleep in the corner of the room and then later claim that you've been burgled. And because he has a sense of adventure, he agrees to this. The lady in question, we're not going to figure this out for about 100 pages, is called Countess Renata Zerkowski. She has a pseudonym, which is Daphne Theodophanos. She's also known as Mary Ann. And we realise that she is a spy on the side of righteousness, and that she is carrying important proofs to London. So he's done the right thing in helping her out. What is going to transpire is as follows. And funnily enough, all the roads do lead to Aunt Matilda, who is incredibly well connected. But effectively, there are all of these violent things going on in the world and student uprisings, and it feels like a lot of agit-prop is going on. And the worried governments of many of the Western nations are wondering who's behind it because it all feels just strangely well organised. And a small council has been formed to investigate, of which the Countess Renata is part, and they draw Sir Stafford into their plans and travel on to meet the person who's at the centre of it. And the person who is indeed at the centre of it is someone called Countess Charlotte von Waldshausen, or Big Charlotte, probably because she's incredibly rich. She's inherited huge wealth, but she's also made lots of money of her own. She is incredibly fat, and we'll get into that in the regressive part of the book. She reminds me a little bit of fat Mrs. Boynton in Appointment with Death, this very tyrannical, bossy, slightly sinister woman. And it turns out that this Countess Charlotte was at school with Aunt Matilda. So at some point, Aunt Matilda will travel to Bavaria to go and meet the Countess Charlotte. Now, interestingly, Countess Charlotte is a neo-Nazi, and she is the one who is funding all of this uprising and these youths that are going to take over everywhere, because she feels that the Nazis got it wrong because they were just concentrating on the German race, and actually their ideals of vicious violent supremacy should be cast globally. And it gets even more insane because we are later to learn that Hitler did not in fact die in the bunker in Berlin, but found a doppelganger. Actually, this bit I find very convincing, right? That there would be a mental asylum which had lots of people who have derangement of being autocrats. Like, this is real, right? There are lots of people around the world who believe themselves to be Napoleon or Julius Caesar, and no doubt Adolf Hitler too. So what this novel posits is that one of these mentally ill doppelgangers actually died in the bunker, and that the real Hitler was smuggled to Argentina, where he shacked up with a blonde woman and had a son. And that son is now called Franz Josef, or the young Siegfried. And he is traveling around the world giving speeches, much like Papadeiros, that are whipping up people into a fervor and a frenzy, and that he is working for and paid for and supported by the Countess Charlotte. And actually, in a really sinister part, well, not that any of this isn't sinister, but in a really rather awful part of the book, it's insinuated that they may even be lovers. So that's the plot that's at the centre of the book. Luckily, Renata has been carrying documents that can expose the fact that young Siegfried is not, in fact, the son of Hitler. So hopefully that's all going to bring it to a close, but I'm not entirely sure why. I mean, surely nothing is taught to us from model politics except for the fact that supporters of people can ignore facts. But anyway, that seems very naive and very hopeful. As if all of this wasn't enough, we have a secret agent called Juanita who manages to assassinate her husband, who's the American ambassador. I'm trying to think if there are any other sort of side plots or side quips. Oh yes, in the final sort of 50 to 100 pages of the book, we end up in Scotland and we realise that another friend of Aunt Matilda's happens to be this amazing scientist who developed a drug that could just basically make everyone super happy. But he decided to get rid of this invention because, of course, it takes away free will. But there are a lot of people in government and senior circles who want this drug to be reconstituted, because surely better to have people happy than committing violence and rising up. So the novel leaves it very ambiguous as to whether this novel drug is going to be used. I think it's called benzo, isn't it, or something sort of, or happiness O or whatever. But I do note that the book Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess was published in 1962. The infamous, notorious film is going to come out in 1971. So the ethical quandary about whether you should treat murderous, violent youth with treatments that kind of take away their free will but make them docile is very much in the public consciousness. And once again, Agatha Christie is just picking up on all of that. I can't believe how crazy this plot is. But again, you see the other artworks of the time, the films, the books, these paranoid fantasies about deep conspiracies, things like the Manchurian Candidate. I mean, this is very much in the public consciousness right now. Did I enjoy reading this book? I definitely enjoyed reading about Aunt Matilda. She is phenomenal. The description of Charlotte I'll get to later, but that is very memorable. It is baggy and it is silly, and I think the final 100 pages or so were very hard to slog through. So would I recommend it? It's so hard because I don't think it's a good book, but I think it touches upon themes that are so in the zeitgeist in which it was written that it is interesting. And I think that the character of Aunt Matilda almost makes it worth it on its own. How was this book received in its own time? I mean, it's worth saying that this was a bestseller. It had a lot of hype, a lot of publicity as the 80th anniversary or 80th birthday novel. It was on the bestseller list for weeks. I think contemporary reviewers and current reviewers at the time were very scathing of it. This is Frances Iles in The Guardian in 1970. Of all the idiotic conventions attaching to the thriller, the silliest is the idea that a car whizzing around a corner at high speed can be aimed at an intended victim who has, quite unseen, stepped off the pavement into the roadway at exactly the right moment. Agatha Christie uses this twice in Passenger to Frankfurt. End quote. Maurice Richardson in The Observer in 1970. Her 80th book, although not her very best, very far from her worst. At moments, one wonders whether the old dear knows the difference between a hippie and a skinhead, but she is still marvellously entertaining. End quote. And then Robert Barnard, writing in the early 80s, quote, the last of the thrillers and one that slides from the unlikely to the inconceivable and finally lands up in incomprehensible muddle. End quote. I don't think that's true. I don't think it's incomprehensible. But anyway, it is an extravaganza. It tells you what it's going to be when you enter into it. How does it hold up to a modern reader aside from the extravaganza-ness? Mr. Robinson, who is a sort of repeat character, so he's already appeared in Cat Among the Pigeons and at Bertram's Hotel as the sort of all-knowing master of finance. He's also going to show up in Poston of Fate. He's always described as having a yellow face, and I can't kind of figure out whether this is a bit of very subconscious, lingering anti-Semitism from Agatha Christie. In the 20s and 30s, all her super rich men were Jews, and they all had sallow faces and were very unattractive to look at. So is this a hangover from that? I don't know. The other thing that I think does stand out to a modern reader is the fat shaming. And I'm going to read you a description of Big Charlotte, which I think is hilarious and so well done and so memorable. I'm just not sure we would write like that anymore. So here we go. Quote, sitting on a vast chair, throne-like in its suggestion, was an enormous woman, a whale of a woman, Stafford and I thought. There really was no other word to describe her. A great, big, cheesy-looking woman, wallowing in fat, double, treble, almost quadruple chins. She wore a dress of stiff orange satin. On her head was an elaborate crown-like tiara of precious stones. Her hands, which rested on the brocaded arms of her seat, were also enormous. Great big fat hands with great big fat shapeless fingers. On each finger, he noticed, was a solitaire ring, and in each ring he thought was a genuine solitaire stone. A ruby, an emerald, a sapphire, a diamond, a pale green stone which he did not know, a chiropras perhaps, a yellow stone which, if not a topaz, was a yellow diamond. She was horrible, he thought. She wallowed in her fat. A great, white, creased, slobbering mass of fat was her face, and set in it, rather like currants in a vast currant bun, were two small black eyes. End quote. I mean, it's great writing. The characters in this book really stand out. It's just not, I don't think we would write like that right now. I would also say the following. You kind of need Sir Stafford Nye in his cloak at the start of the novel so that Renata has a disguise to change into. But why do you need Sir Stafford Nye for the rest of the novel? Couldn't Renata just do everything on her own? So I just leave you with that, dear reader. In terms of adaptations, there have not been any of them. It's the only one of four. Sorry, it is one of only four Christie novels not to have received an adaptation, including Death Comes at the End, which is set in ancient Egypt, Destination Unknown, and Poston of Fate. Apparently, and I was listening to the All About Agatha podcast on this, and I love that podcast so much, and it's really sad, the episode on Passenger to Frankfurt, because it's the first one where the co-host, Catherine Broback, who died tragically, and suddenly at an incredibly young age, it's the first episode that she's not on. So memorable for that reason, if no other. But they pointed out that apparently there was a movie producer who had made The French Connection, who wanted to make an adaptation of this. I actually think it would make quite a good one of those like Roger Moore James Bond films, because it is so ludicrous, and a lot of those really were ludicrous. But, you know, Agatha Christie had seen those awful Margaret Rutherford Miss Marples that bore no relationship to her book, and she was very much not in favour of having film adaptations. So the book stands on its own. Well, that has been a little whirlwind discussion of Passenger Frankfurt. I am a little bit fond of it, but it's a crazy book. I almost think it's worth reading because it's so unlike the other stuff that Agatha was writing at this time. But even at her most extravagant, there are still things that are worthy of our time, which I think show, and nearing 80 when she wrote this, pretty impressive. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. We will be back next time for a fully hosted podcast episode, not just me talking to myself. We'll be discussing the Miss Marple book Nemesis. In the meantime, thank you for listening.